Hello and welcome to Cosmological Arguments. I'm your host, John Bannon. This video is a continuation in a series. This is Debunking Atheism, Volume 2. Now, I've personally argued with atheists and agnostics for almost 10 years online, and I'm very, very good at it. Uh, and I have a lot of experience in the types of arguments they raise and how to answer back their arguments successfully. Now, I'm just going to go through a bunch of things that I know to be true when arguing or dealing with atheists. Now, the first thing you got to remember or you got to understand is that uh, the chances of you changing an atheist's mind that God exists is pretty close to zero. They are not really arguing with you to let them learn something that might lead them back to a belief in God. They're really just arguing to convince you that God doesn't exist. So uh, don't expect any of them to change their minds, regardless of how good your argument is. That just seems to be the nature of atheists and agnostics. They just, generally speaking, they just are entrenched in their belief and they will not change it. So don't expect to change their minds, but you can certainly argue with them uh, either for your own benefit to test out maybe arguments that you have, or so that other people who may be listening or watching and who are undecided will come to see your arguments as a strength for the existence of God. And that could be important to those people. So uh, here's a bunch of things you might hear atheists or non believers argue to theists or believers in God. You may hear something like, it's the theist's burden of proof to prove God exists. The truth is, there is no burden of proof on the question of God's existence. There is no rule book anywhere that says that. There is actually no burden of proof at all. Each person is left to decide on their own, for whatever reasons they may have, whether God exists or not. But you, as a theist, you certainly do not have this imaginary burden of proof that the atheist would like to place on you. They may cite some atheist philosopher like Bertrand Russell to claim that you have this burden of proof and explain Bertrand Russell's teapot. But the truth is, that's just the opinion of an atheist philosopher that you happen to have the burden. But the truth is, no one has the burden. You may hear atheists say something like, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, because the claim that God exists is extraordinary. It's your burden to prove he exists through the use of extraordinary evidence. Now, that's just a claim, a phrase that Carl Sagan came up with, and he was an atheist. Um, it's absolutely false. There's no truth that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. There is no law or court in the world that holds that to be true. In fact, the whole idea of extraordinary evidence um, is absurd. All you need is evidence. You don't need extraordinary evidence. Evidence can prove anything. You don't need extraordinary evidence. Um, and God does not need to be proven by some extra burden or special extra evidence. No, generally speaking, people believe things to be true if they're more likely than not, which means it's at least 50% likelihood that this thing is true. Uh, it would be great to have a 100% certainty based on some sort of proof that God was real, but it's certainly not necessary in order to believe in God. You really only need to have a greater than 50% likelihood or certainty that God is real in order to believe in God. Um, so that raises another question about certainty, and academic philosophers like to have 100% certainty in their philosophical arguments. So even the tiniest little pinprick that somebody could put in a philosophical argument has the effect of blowing the argument up like a balloon. Boom, it blows up. But that's only because academic philosophers are trained to seek out that sort of 100% certainty and don't fall prey to the idea that philosophical arguments aren't good or aren't persuasive unless they're 100% certain. That's not true at all. You can use philosophical arguments for their persuasive value to convince somebody that God is more likely than not, regardless of whether some academic philosopher has stuck a little pinprick in it um, that made it less than 100% certain. So be careful. Be careful of that. Remember that academic philosopher types are raising the standard of proof, the level of proof necessary to close to 100%. And ordinary, reasonable people don't do that. They don't go to that 100% level. Only academics who publish papers and are worried about their peers criticizing them go to those sorts of levels as close to 100% as they can get. But ordinary people don't do that. Ordinary people, 50% or higher is fine for every reasonable person. Uh, and another argument atheists will make is that there's no evidence of God. They'll keep claiming that. No evidence of God. That's just not true. It's a lie. So don't fall for it. Circumstantial evidence is evidence. In every court of law in the world, circumstantial evidence is evidence. You can prove even someone committed a murder through circumstantial evidence. You don't need direct evidence or scientific evidence to hang somebody. Um, Circumstantial evidence is evidence legally. So when some atheist says, "Oh, there's no evidence for God," you say you're wrong. There's circumstantial evidence, and here they are in the form of the cosmological arguments for the existence of God. Atheists love to claim that God is special pleading. Special pleading is a logical fallacy. The logical fallacy of special pleading essentially says that if you're going to say there's a universal truth, you can't just conveniently accept the thing that you want from that universal truth because you're making a special exception for your particular truth, but not everybody else's. So it's favoritism, essentially, for your own particular belief. That's a fallacy. Because you favor a particular belief doesn't make it more true than somebody else's belief. That's special pleading. However, God is not special pleading. And the reason God is not special pleading, because special pleading does not apply to justifiable exceptions. There are justifiable exceptions to universal truths. That doesn't make them special pleading, it makes them justifiable exceptions. So, the way out of the special pleading argument is to claim God is a justifiable exception. So you may run into this argument where the atheist non-believer says, well, which of the 4,000 gods is your God? What makes you think he's real and the 3,999 other gods aren't? Uh, there's an easy answer to that. And you say, well, it's not special pleading because my God is a justifiable exception. Because my God, unlike all other gods, all the 3,999 other ones, is uncaused. That is a justifiable exception. In order to be the creator of physical reality, God would have to be uncaused. So you simply say, well, God is uncaused. That makes him a justifiable exception. It's not special pleading. And if you research it, and you actually look up these other pagan gods that they're referring to, they are all caused gods, or gods that are made of parts. If they have a part of any sort, that's a caused god. If it has a body, if it was born by a parent of some sort, born in some way, that's a caused being. If it's self-created, that's not uncaused either because it was caused by itself. And you'll find that you can look through the pantheon of gods throughout history, and you're only going to find one uncaused singular God, and that's the God of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. Now they may try to be tricky and say, well, is it Allah or is it Jesus or is it one of the names given to God in the Old Testament? Uh, and you just say to them, you're just naming the same God. Just because you give a different name to the same God doesn't mean it's a different God. But you'll get arguments like this. Um, I think one of the Old Testament names is Elohim, I think, or Yahweh. They'll say, well, Yahweh is different than Allah. And that's not true. They're talking about the same. It's the same God, and God is defined, by me at least, as the uncaused metaphysical cause of physical reality, who decides what to make real and what not to make real out of the infinite logical possibilities for physical reality. God is the creator of physical reality. Some people may say, well, God is love, and then they'll cite the Gospel of John. Well, God is love, but that's describing God's nature as opposed to God's role in reality. God's role in reality is as creator. God's role is not as love. Um, so be clear about that. They may try to confuse you regarding God, claiming God is one of God's characteristics, such as loving in nature. Um, Another thing is that the belief in the existence of God is a reasoned belief. It is not a faith-based belief. Don't confuse uh, a faith-based belief with a reasoned belief. For instance, the belief that Jesus is the Son of God. is a faith-based belief. But the belief that God exists and is real is a reasoned belief. You should have good reason to believe that. Um, and the cosmological arguments are what give you circumstantial evidence and reasonable grounds to believe that God exists and is real. But it's a reasoned logical decision to believe that God is real. It's not a faith-based decision. Some people believe God is real on the basis that God is self-evident, looking at nature and reality, and the belief that there must be a God in order to account for all of that. That, in and of itself, is still a reasoned belief. You have a reason for believing in God. A lot of atheists, non-believers, will try to um, denigrate God by calling him things like a sky daddy or a Santa Claus or Easter bunny for adults. Uh, these are childish assertions by non-believers, uh, degrading God. Uh, God is not an Easter bunny or Santa Claus or a sky daddy. God is not like a pagan god, a god that walks around on Mount Olympus like the Zeus being. God is an uncaused being. An uncaused being is beyond time and space, is invisible, is the creator of physical reality. That is very, very different concept than some sort of guy floating on a cloud up in the air, a sky daddy or some guy in a sleigh flying through the air with his reindeer or hopping along delivering eggs. That's a very different concept. Those sorts of things are caused beings. They're fictional, but they're also caused. They have parts. Uh, if you have parts, you're a caused being. You can't be God. So these sorts of sky daddy insults are really given mostly by um, ignorant atheists and non-believers who really don't even understand the concept of God as an uncaused metaphysical cause. You'd be surprised at how many people don't know that simple fact. Um, uh, Another atheistic argument is, well, um, why aren't there more than one God? Which God are you talking about? Can't there be multiple gods? How come it's only one God? And the answer to that is, well, God cannot be made of parts. To be uncaused, God cannot be made of parts. And all that really means, this idea of divine simplicity, all that really means is that God is not physical reality. God is not a physical reality or a material thing. God is beyond space time and physical reality. So God is not made of parts. Well, if you had more than one God in a metaphysical sense, then God would have parts. There'd be a differentiation between gods, which would be parts. That's impossible. That would be a caused situation, and God is uncaused. So there can only be one God, um, because otherwise there would be parts, metaphysical parts, and that can't be God. Now, a lot of these counter arguments I'm giving you rely heavily on an understanding of philosophy and metaphysics in particular. such as the metaphysics of St. Thomas Aquinas. And a lot of this sounds very medieval, and that's because it is. But it's also basic logic and reasoning. And philosophy goes back to the ancient Greeks, so it's thousands of years old. And a lot of people are completely unfamiliar with philosophy. But if you want to argue successfully with non believers and atheists, you need to start learning philosophy. That's how you do it. Um, so, a lot of these terms you're going to have to pick up and learn as you go along, and you learn some philosophy. Another thing is God is not an invention of man. Some atheists will try to argue that God was invented in pagan times by sheep herders, and the God that you believe in is really just an evolved version of this pagan tribal God, and therefore your God isn't real. Well, the problem with that argument is God was not invented by man. God was discovered by man. And the idea of a uncaused metaphysical cause of physical reality is independent of man. The arguments for God's existence don't depend on whether man exists or not. So whether man, told stories of these pagan gods is irrelevant to whether God actually exists or not. The existence of God is independent of the existence of man. It's independent of the existence of the Bible. It's independent of the existence of the earth. So those sorts of arguments don't fly. Another very important thing to keep in mind when you're arguing or talking to atheists or non believers about the existence of God is not to confuse mathematics and mathematical models with physical reality. Oftentimes, these non believers will reference some scientific theory that some physicist has and then basically present it as if it's proven truth. And it's not. It's not. It's just a theory. Scientists have theories all the time. The question is whether it has been proven or not. And oftentimes it's not. Or the proof may just be a mathematical proof, a mathematical model of what physical reality might be. But there's no discovery or experiment that has proven the thing to actually be true. So be very careful of confusing math with physical reality. Sometimes mathematical models do accurately represent physical reality, but sometimes they don't. And it's just math. And just because it makes mathematical sense doesn't mean that it is the actual truth in physical reality, which is what we're concerned with here. Um, Another common mistake is atheists will say, well, look at outer space. It's empty. I don't see a God there. It's nothingness. Well, they've wrongly defined nothingness. Nothingness, absolute nothingness, is the absence of God and any physical reality that God had created. Um, Outer space, understand, is a created thing. It was caused by the expanded singularity in Big Bang cosmology. Uh, it's not proof that God doesn't exist. It's a created thing. So, if anything, it proves something had to create it, even if it is completely empty. Nevertheless, outer space is a created thing. Physicists call it the quantum field. Now, the thing with the quantum field is that it is a created thing. It's created by the Big Bang, or, well, the expanded singularity caused an inflationary period. supposedly, which created the quantum field. It's a created thing, though, and created things need a creator, something that creates it. Uh, they may, some atheists may argue with you, claiming that the universe was created as a fluctuation from the quantum field, and that's what created everything. Well, the big problem with that argument is there's no scientific proof that the quantum field pre-existed the Big Bang. So it couldn't have caused the Big Bang because there's no proof that it existed prior to the Big Bang. There is no scientific proof or evidence of any physical reality that pre-exists the expanding singularity in Big Bang cosmology. Atheists and non-believers will often lie to try to convince you that there's no God, knowing full well that they're lying to you. And not presenting the facts or presenting only one viewpoint of those facts. And they forget to, or they refuse to tell you really important things that would undermine their arguments. So be careful when you're arguing with atheists and non-believers. They are often dishonest. Don't assume they're telling you the truth. Research it yourself. If you're not sure about something, research it yourself. Google it yourself. Figure out what the truth really is about this particular point. Just don't rely on some non-believer's word. Big mistake. Some non-believers and atheists will try to bring the Holy Trinity into the argument and claim that, well, under the Trinity, God is three persons: God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. And therefore, God has parts, and he can't be this singular, uncaused, metaphysical cause that you're talking about. Well, the answer to that is that the Trinity, as a doctrine of the Catholic Church, doesn't have a philosophical proof for its existence. The Trinity is considered a revealed truth, a revelation. That is because Jesus told uh, us that this was the case, that there were three persons in one God, then it must be true. But there's no philosophical proof for that. So it's a revealed mystery. Uh, don't get trapped into trying to explain what cannot be explained because it's a revealed mystery. The Trinity is a revealed mystery. It's not the subject of a philosophical proof. None of the cosmological arguments prove the Trinity, nor can they, because it's simply a revealed mystery. Don't expect to be able to prove the Trinity in philosophical terms or with a philosophical proof because you can't. It's a revealed mystery, and leave it at that. Another argument non-believers love to make is that somehow God is not omnipotent. And they'll say something like, well, can God create a rock that even God can't lift? If he can't, well, doesn't that make him less than omnipotent? He doesn't have all power because he can't lift this rock. Or we'll have the old argument of, well, can't God create a square circle? The square circle. These are impossibilities. They're logical impossibilities. God is only capable of creating what is logically possible, not what is illogical and impossible. Now, that is not a knock on God's power, because God has all real powers. That's what omnipotence means, all powers. but they're all real powers. It has to be a real power. Um, and the power to create an illogical or impossible thing like a square circle is not a real power. It's an illusory power. No one has that power. The power doesn't exist in reality. The power isn't anywhere. So God can't have a power that isn't real, that doesn't exist anywhere. So it's not a knock on God's omnipotence not to have an illusory power that doesn't exist, such as the power to create a square circle or a rock that even God couldn't lift. This is not a limitation on God. What it is it's an understanding of what a power really is, and not confusing a real power with an illusory or impossible power or imagined power. So, in other words, just because God doesn't have every power that you can possibly imagine, where those imagined powers are illusory or impossible, doesn't make God not omnipotent. Uh, Non-believers and atheists also like to argue infinities. They'll claim all sorts of things in physical reality are infinite. They'll claim that the universe is infinitely big, or that you can subdivide things into smaller and smaller pieces, infinitely small, or that time is infinite. Um, the existence of an actual infinity in physical reality, it usually helps atheistic arguments. However, the scientific proof is that there is no actual infinite in physical reality. Not a single instance of an actual infinite has ever been scientifically proven to exist. So everything is finite in physical reality. And that helps the theist's argument um, for simple reasons. Finite things need beginnings, they need something to create them, a creator, God. Infinities, not so much. But there aren't actual infinities in physical reality. So, an atheist who claims there's an infinity in physical reality, just say there's no proof that that's true. They may claim that somehow it has been proven, but it hasn't. It hasn't. You can do some research and you'll figure out it hasn't been proven. When arguing with atheists or non-believers, if they start getting mad and angry um, and start calling you names, um, just understand that they're getting frustrated because you're beating them. You're giving them arguments that are countering what they're saying, and it's making them angry or frustrated or scared. And so they're impulsively acting out by trying to degrade you through some sort of attack. But understand that when they're doing that, they're losing. They're losing to you, and that's why they're angry. Now, you shouldn't get angry because, again, that's a sign that you're losing your argument. So try to stay composed. You should also be aware of Occam's razor. Now, Occam's razor is a philosophical device that basically says if the least number of assumptions, the explanation that requires the least number of assumptions is usually the correct one. So it's used to eliminate um, added ideas or superfluous ideas. So the bare minimum necessary to arrive at a result is usually the truth. So uh, what atheists will try to do is put God in the position of being superfluous or unnecessary for the result. And then implicitly, God gets eliminated through Occam's razor. So you got to be very careful about that. God has to have a role. If God doesn't have a necessary role, then you've probably lost your argument. Now, I know that you should win this argument. So if you lost it, it's your fault, not mine. Um, but be aware of Occam's razor. And another fact is you can't disprove God. God is outside of space time. God is the uncaused metaphysical cause of physical reality. There is no way to leave the universe and prove that God's there or not. So there is no way for an atheist or non believer to prove God doesn't exist. It can't be done. So always remember that there's no threat that any non believer is going to be able to prove to you that God can't exist. Um, you can't disprove God. You can't you can't prove the negative. That is, there is no God. So keep that in mind. Um, Another thing is the cosmological arguments give you philosophical reasons to believe that God is real. However, they all don't prove that God is necessarily intelligent. So, one of the questions that may arise with non believers is God intelligent? So maybe they'll say, well, you've proven God exists, but you haven't proved that that metaphysical cause is necessarily intelligent. So what are you really talking about here? Uh, Now, there are arguments for why God is intelligent, and you should learn them as well. Some of the cosmological arguments include an argument for why God is intelligent, such as the dichotomy of existence does, the Kalam cosmological argument, uh, in greater detail that I gave you, gives an argument for why God is intelligent. Thomas Aquinas has his own arguments for why God is intelligent, set forth in his work Summa Gentilis. I think that's the name of it. You can look them up yourself. But understand the argument of whether God exists and whether God is intelligent are really two different sorts of philosophical arguments. Um, and they're addressed in different ways. The cosmological arguments, the 20 cosmological arguments I've given you, Um, there may be more of them. I don't know. Those are the only ones I know of, but I'm always finding new ones. They're essentially your weapons against non-believers and atheists. These arguments you can use to disprove what they're saying or to give answers to their objections. Those are the weapons at your disposal uh, in your arguments with non-believers. So you really should know the cosmological arguments and understand the basis for them. Uh, Atheists and non-believers love to throw out logical fallacies. They'll claim you violated this logical fallacy or that logical fallacy. Understand what logical fallacies are. There's a list of them. You can look them up yourself. They're taught in philosophy class. They're essentially errors, logic errors that can be made in reasoning and logical deduction. Some of them are formal, some of them are informal. You can find, if somebody cites a logical fallacy to you and you don't know what it is, look it up and find out what it is, and then you may be able to discover that there is an exception to this fallacy, or a way out of this fallacy, or a way to distinguish your situation from what this fallacy is, so that you can say to the non-believer that, aha, this fallacy doesn't apply in this circumstance because of this reason. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to agree with you, because you may have taken away their only argument, but they're still going to argue it because that's the only thing they got left. And they won't admit you beat them, but you've got to understand that you did. You have to be able to make that judgment to determine whether you really have beaten somebody else's argument or not. Because don't expect them to admit it, because they won't. Even if you beat them soundly, they will never admit that that's what you did. So you have to have confidence in your own logic and reasoning abilities to understand whether you have addressed or debunked some non-believer's argument or not. Um, Another argument that atheists and non-believers love to bring up is the conservation of energy or mass, or maybe the laws of thermodynamics. And they'll say something along the lines of, well, matter and energy cannot be created or destroyed, and therefore it must have always existed. Well, the problem with that argument is, while it's true that there is a law of conservation of mass and energy and the laws of thermodynamics, and that it is true that matter and energy cannot be created or destroyed, but only transformed. At the beginning of the universe, with the Big Bang, um, the laws of physics break down. So our current laws of physics, including the law of conservation of energy and mass and the laws of thermodynamics, didn't apply at the expanded singularity, the first appearance of the expanded singularity in Big Bang cosmology, because the laws of physics that we have now no longer apply. They break down. So the Big Bang is the creation of energy and mass and eventually matter. And that is, in fact, a violation of the principle of conservation of energy and mass. But that's because the laws of physics broke down at that moment of creation. And there was no principle of conservation of energy and mass or law of thermodynamics. So remember that about the Big Bang. The Big Bang is the theist's best argument from science that God must exist, because what created the Big Bang? What created the expanded singularity? God did. And the atheists and non-believers will try to somehow convince you that doesn't matter. But the truth is that matters a lot. The Big Bang is absolutely the number one scientific proof for the existence of God. And use that argument. It's your best argument in terms of science. A few other things. I don't bother arguing with non-believers and atheists on scientific points which I believe are fully established. And there really is no point in arguing with them about this. Like the the truth that the universe is 13.8 billion years old. Um, that's indisputable, really. So why bother arguing that that's not true, or that evolution isn't a fact? Well, there's a mountain of evidence that evolution is in fact true. So I wouldn't bother arguing that evolution wasn't true. You're not going to win those arguments. Um, so I would stay away from uh, trying to undermine established scientific fact because you're going to lose because everybody's not going to believe you because the science proves you're wrong. So why go down that path to begin with? I know the book of Genesis, if it's literally interpreted, uh, creates certain issues with modern science, contradicts it really. However, the book of Genesis should be read figuratively, not literally. Uh, and that way you can avoid having to have to support things in the book of Genesis which are just not scientifically true. Um, and for those issues, I usually say to them that I read the book of Genesis figuratively, not literally. And the books that really matter, for a Christian at least, are the Gospels. So I refer them to the New Testament. I don't worry about the book of Genesis that much. Okay, well, that's a lot about arguing with atheists and non-believers, and I hope you learned something. Um, just remember that there are tons and tons and tons of atheistic arguments, and there are tons and tons and tons of theistic replies and ways to get out of them. And there is always a way to get out of an atheistic or non-believer's argument. There's always a way. You just don't know what it is. And you've got to educate yourself, watching videos like this, for instance, to find out how to get out of that argument. Don't just assume the atheist is right, because they're not. There's a way to get out of it. You just don't know what it is. Find out what it is. All right. Hope you learned something, and take care.